Get started again. We are getting some of the, I always use AirPlay, and then I use my iPad and advance the slides, and Jeff uses the back computer back there, and then you got to use a clicker to advance it, so we got to get the slides on the computer there, so forgive us as they do that here in a minute. But Jeff, we need to introduce them to what you're going to talk about next. So we are in, how many of you have this book right in front of you?
We're supposed to have handed out now. They got this.
All right, yeah. Okay, you've got that large thing. That's good. But do you have these books?
Yeah, they're going to pass.
Okay, we'll pass them out.
How many, hold it up if you have this with you. I want to get it.
We do have a limited amount of copies, so if you already have one,
See, that tells me
turn your microphone on, Jeff. Turn your microphone on.
Sorry. Only half of you read Michael's paper, and only a third of you brought these, of which you were instructed last week to bring these because you need them, because you're going to actually work in them. So tomorrow, bring them. We don't have any more. Josh won't give me any more.
Okay, so as you're getting this thick booklet, let's give you an orientation to it. Open it up, if you will. It's this one right here.
You got to have the adapter for.
He's got it. Yeah. He's got it.
He knows.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're going to talk for a little
Okay.
while anyway.
So open up the big thick book to page 3, which is the table of contents. And what we're going to be taking you through this afternoon is session 1 and 2. So session 1, I'll just read it here. The New Perspective on Paul, Rethinking Western Hermeneutics. And we'll talk about modern search for the historical Paul, Paul as a coherent, integrated thinker, the apostolic traditioning of Paul from schema to principles, to processes, to practices, and topoi as a clustering, overarching subsections and asides. So, let's fill in the gaps here in just a moment. Number 2, session 2 that we'll also go through with slides is the canonical structure of Paul's letters, that the canonical, that is Paul's corpus of letters, and then the new perspective on Paul, and how that gives us the Pauline corpus, the Gospels and perspective on Paul, early letters and the Gospels, and then the Petrine circle of letters, or the Catholic epistles as they're also called. So, Jeff, before you stand up, how do we want to light the flame of intelligence with them around? What is the importance of these two?
Well,
sessions?
Let's back up a little bit more.
Okay.
And have you described obviously Michael and a lot of our team have mastered all of our stuff. Michael did like 900 projects, getting through everything. But when we were going through mastering the scriptures, and particularly, I think, Timothy?
First, Second Timothy.
First and Second Timothy.
And then we did we redid First and Second Corinthians after that. So we did them a little out of written order, but we did the later letters, and then we went back to the Corinthian correspondent letters.
Yeah, it took about a decade to do this. We put the Gospels in the middle of it. We did the story in the middle of it, and then we had to go back and redo First and Second Corinthians. Just as the pieces came together. But halfway through or not have, when we were going through Paul's third set of letters particularly,
2021,
You said-
2022, yep.
yeah, you said several times that gave you confidence that it's not that you didn't have before, but it gave you a new level of confidence.
Yep.
So why, and now you've said the same thing about all of the mastering the scriptures, but why is that? How would you, because what I hear consistently, I'm working mostly with the Chinese cohorts right now, but what I hear consistently is they get the paradigm, they get the framework, they're starting the gathering, but they don't have confidence to build their networks. We can ask you and you can give us answers, but we don't have confidence and we can't solve some of the problems as they pop up. But what you've consistently said is there's a great increase of confidence in what we're doing with you, but what you will do if you master this. That's a big part of why you've driven, kind of to get this front and center on this trip.
So I think a lot of times, I don't know how to unpack that, but I hope over the next 3 days you can see the breadth and depth of the answer to that core question. In a couple minutes here, let me just answer it with, I have felt like through my lifetime, these biblical truths are these little, and N.T. Wright uses this metaphor, but are these pearls. You got these little nuggets, these little pearls of wisdom, these pearls of how to live, and you read 10 verses and wow, that's a pearl. But I've not known where to fit all the pearls on a beautiful necklace. I've not known how to, and so you have these little situations in life, but especially as in the last 5 years or a little bit more, the second curve has become clearer and clearer and clearer that that's where the Holy Spirit has us in our day. And so as you think more about second curve activity, we at the same time were going through, I think the Spirit was pushing that into our hearts and into our minds and into our dialogue. And meanwhile, we were getting hit with, from a financial side, from Western foundations, and at the same time, we were going through Paul's later letters. Well, why did we begin to get confidence in Paul's later letters? Because what you see Paul say to Timothy is not go and make disciple after disciple, but he says, go, in 2 Timothy in particular, he's talking about you have to develop the same skills of building the way I built. Develop the same acumen, develop the same, and then when you begin to look back at all of Paul's letters, you can see these, let's call them pearls, you can begin to see in his early letters, oh my goodness, he's doing a set of things in his early letters to build the network of churches already. Now, he maybe grew in his understanding as the Spirit, more churches and more came into the fold as the book of Acts unfolded and the whole New Testament unfolded. But he's doing certain things in Romans 16 at the end. He's directing network traffic. He's directing network traffic. It's not just a list of names that you're supposed to read in Sunday school and not be able to pronounce. It's a pearl that actually fits inside of building networks of churches. And so to me, that 1 Corinthians 16 at the end, he's doing the same thing. And those are early letter stuff. And you can go through his middle letters. We're going to go through here, and I made a chart of it. But leadership decisions of how that Paul made in his early, middle, and later letters. And so, Jeff, to a confidence point of view, what are you doing?
I'm changing my
your batteries. I see what you're doing now. I thought he was peeling an orange or something up here. Anyway, it's not what he's doing.
I'm changing my hearing devices.
Hearing
And they're
aids.
hearing devices, not hearing aids.
Hearing
because
aids.
hearing aids are for old people.
Hearing aids is what they are.
Hearing devices,
Hearing aids.
done well, I can not only hear you, but I can tell what you're thinking.
They're hearing. And what he's thinking is they're still hearing aids. Okay,
Randy used to sell them, the really good ones, and the young people, don't they? They buy them and put them in because they can hear better.
the hearing aids talking about?
10%, everything.
So for me, I think from Paul was also saying to Timothy to have apostolic authority, that there's Ephesians 4, there's a social structure to building complex networks, and there's an authority that has to come with it, just like there is with elders in local churches, just like a father is in a social structure family there. So for me, that whole being able to just see that that's what the text says with confidence and see that that's what it's doing gave me a whole bunch of confidence of how we need to function in real life in all the complex situations that all of you are in. Because we have to bring Paul's traditioning process to bear in all of our situations.
And so besides mastering Paul's letters themselves, according to what their intent was, in here, we take you through a process of being able to really master these at a pretty good level, his letters. But we also take and look at it from the angle of, in the early letters, the middle letters, the later letters, what problems did he have to solve? Because there's actually a subset of problems in the whole process of establishing churches. Then if you line them up, and we'll show you a couple charts, that gives you benchmarks to how to measure how you're establishing them. And then we did another section in here that says, okay, because Paul did this, what was he thinking? Because he gives us the clue of what he was thinking. That's the session 5. But think of it like this. See, you've got the framework of Acts, and you get down the road a little bit in Series 3. Series 1 and 2 of First Principles, you get, the passages to get people basically established. Series 3, you start now how to interpret. You look at Acts, and you touch into Paul's early, middle, later letters. Then you cycle the third time, and you go into mastering the Scriptures. And if you think of it like Acts gives you the framework, but then you see things in there like Paul appointed elders in every church in Acts 14:23. Mm-hmm. So you got to determine what stays and what doesn't stay. What's intended by Luke to show you how the Great Commission really unfolded as a multiplication of churches. But then when you put Paul's letters in their place, he appointed elders in every church, you got 2 big sections when he says, set in order what remains, 1 Timothy and Titus, and what it means to set those orders, elders in place. But not only how to set them in place with the qualifications, but how to put Timothy in there to correct them and clean up a mess when it got messy. So if you put all those in place and really learn them, you will be able to do what Paul did in building a complex network according to Christ's design. And we know that Paul was chosen to bring to light what is Christ's grand strategy, his administration for everything. So you realize that that's actually Christ's strategy, which is another way of saying the mind of Christ. So it's and so some people are saying, as these are unfolding, well, we got the encyclicals and the first principles, and we really know what we're doing. And so then they say we don't need mastering the Scriptures. It's too hard. But the problem is they're built on a totally different hermeneutic than the academic hermeneutic of the West. Completely upside down. I'm even going to show you linguistics and what's coming in our Greek companion piece to this in the future. But so you have to understand this hermeneutic, and that's what we're going to focus on. We're really going to go a deep dive on it.
This is a deep dive. This is top shelf. But let's summarize what our role is to equip you to become master craftsmen of building networks of churches. That's our job, to equip you. Whether you knew you signed up for that or all of that, it doesn't really matter. Our role here in these next few days is to help equip you to become master craftsmen. That's what Paul was saying to Timothy in 2 Timothy. It wasn't just disciple making a disciple. He says, build this whole thing. This is the administration of the plan that was given. Work hard like a farmer, be trained like an athlete, and be disciplined as a soldier. Don't let people look down upon you, but you need to do these things. Carry on these traditions. Okay, I think let's get into...
Should we go into it?
Yep.
All right, I'm going to stand up like Michael did while we're doing the bulk of the slides, but I bashed up my leg pretty bad, so we thought I broke the shin, but it's been x-rayed, and so it's an egg here and my foot's all blue, so I don't know how long I'll be able to stand. And people ask me, how did you do it? And I said, well, there's a really kind of mean dog that's loose in our neighborhood, and people were really afraid of it. So the dog, I was watching out because some of the kids were walking, and I thought, oh man, that dog could attack. So I quick ran and grabbed the dog, wrestled it to the ground, held it by its throat, but I hurt my leg in the process. In other words, I slipped getting into the tub and broke my shin. I actually did this once.
I've never heard that story.
Well, listen to this. This is a true story. What in Australia, Australians.
Well, the last part of your paragraph was true. The other parts were not.
In Tasmania, Homer Simpson is kind of like their idol. You know, they're kind of they're just a rough bunch.
The great theologian Homer Simpson.
And so we're clear out by where the cliffs are in the northeast part, and but on the way there from where I was staying, they have these things on the front of their big bars on the front of all their cars and everything because they hit kangaroos all the time. But they also hit Tasmanian devils, and they're real. And so I was late to one of the meetings, but on the way there was a roadkill Tasmanian devil. And so I asked him to put it in the trunk. And so when I got to the place, I stood up and I said, I really apologize for being late on this, but we were attacked by a Tasmanian devil, and I grabbed it by the throat and killed it. And I held up the roadkill. I did that.
How'd it go over?
Oh. All right, now we just wasted about 10 minutes of our valuable time.
At least we know you don't have a dog loose in your neighborhood, I guess.
Okay, Teaching Mastering the Scriptures. The subtitle, Paul's Traditioning Process of Establishing Churches. Passing down the traditions, which is the authoritative teaching, is what Paul claimed he was doing in several places, in 1 Corinthians and 1 and 2 Thessalonians. But what's interesting is all the way to Tertullian in the year 200, he talks about the fact that the churches were established according to Paul's traditioning process. So this is not, it's a biblical concept and not a new concept. So in other words, how do we take the apostolic teaching, the core of it being Paul's, but also Peter's, the Petrine Circle, and John's as they unfold, how do we take the apostolic teaching and make that authoritative teaching that we bring to all of the churches, Paul said, in establishing church networks, which what he was doing with his letters. And so this is a totally different entry point to hermeneutics than the West. Totally different entry point, because the West is academic, and it's primarily coming from the sharpness that's needed to settle the debates down through the centuries, and it does not start from church-based. It starts from academic-based or academy-based. And so this is actually upside down in terms of how we go about hermeneutics. It has huge implications, even for Bible translation, and how we move the ideas across culture. Now, this diagram I'm going to come back to again and again. This is the whole idea of It doesn't pick up the encyclicals and that kind of framework. It doesn't pick up the life development. But as far as the core engine of really beginning to master the scriptures, everything's here. You see, right here is the first principles. And that's a biblical concept. Paul says, I'm establishing you in the first principles of the faith. When you get them, you're established. But then he also talks with Timothy, after Timothy being with him for 20 years, and he says essentially in 1 Timothy chapter 2, it says several places that Timothy, you are now basically a master craftsman. So our objective is to get from the first principles of the faith to a master craftsman. And Paul was a master craftsman who passed on that sound doctrine, that sound teaching, that traditioning process. Remember he said to him, to Timothy, not only do you need to hold the sound doctrine, but you also need to do the same thing to the churches that I did. There's a daily, the concern for the churches and the fact that you have to keep those churches solving problems and stable and multiplying and move from generation to generation. So the process that Paul did with the churches is also what he exhorted Timothy that was part of 2 Timothy 2:2. So it's not just kind of who's kind of the smartest or the wisest or who have done this the longest. It's who's mastered the framework that we've been given. So it's open to all of us as leaders. So we'll keep coming back to this. Before we're done, too, we're looking at this right here, teaching Mastering the Scriptures, and the assessment. I hope next year we have in our hands teaching Mastering the Scriptures Greek, because in just 6 sessions in this, built on this kind of a foundation, you will learn all that you need to learn to be able to use Greek, and then there'll be a follow-up one on Hebrews, to be able to use it in this system. Because how you study language is totally different than how seminary teaches Greek and Hebrew. And it also redoes linguistics, because linguistics, well, I won't go there now. I'll never get anywhere if I keep doing that. Okay, here's the outline, the new perspective of Paul, Rethinking Western Hermeneutics. I put subtitles under it in the outline. Nancy got cleaned up. They were actually, my slides were in bad shape, and because we improved things as we went along. But then canonical structure and the new perspective on Paul. New perspective on Paul. What all that really means is, let's go back and find the original Paul. Systematic theology buried original Paul. There's no story attached to systematic theology. And so it's like going back and rediscovering Paul and rediscovering the church. Paul's traditioning process. Okay, here we're going to show you the actual process itself and the schematic of setting churches in order. Then we're going to look at Paul's on-the-fly doing theology within culture, within the grand schema. Remember in Corinthians, he says, in Corinthians they got all these fights. They got divisive all the way through. And Paul's thinking on his feet. I mean, the Spirit's leading, but I mean, he's working within that framework. And sometimes he says, I got this from the Spirit, or I got this from the Lord. Sometimes he says, I think I got this from the Lord. And a couple other times he basically says, this is what I think. And that's because within the range, when you've got the right foundation, you have to develop the capacity, like Paul, to be able to solve complicated problems which are different in different cultures. So this is all designed to take you there. Then Paul's letters as tools for building complex networks. This is the one that actually when Michael and I started talking, he said, we really need to go after this. His thought was we could almost spend the whole time on session 5. Because session 5 gives you benchmarks, but session 5 really gets into the problems he was solving and what his thinking processes were in solving them. Then the Gospels and the new perspective on Paul. We say, okay, how do the Gospels fit? Everybody thinks you read the Gospels first. You're supposed to study them first. And let's start with Matthew. Well, okay, let's look at the Gospels outside of their context, outside of their intended purpose. Let's take the hardest one, Matthew, and study it first. And in light of 400 to 500 years of debate in theology, particularly from the Reform side, you're completely lost. People haven't solved, for 400 years, they haven't solved some of those problems. And so as a result, we have 30,000 plus denominations. The whole thing is upside down. So we're going to put the Gospels back in context, and then we're going to a session just on using this tool. And then there's appendixes, comprehensive assessment of complex networks, of apostolic networks. This is assessment that is a lot of work, but you can sit down and go through all the letters, look at the questions that fit with every session that go right out of the author's intent, identify the session, the problems in your network, identify the session you should go to if you haven't worked all the way through them yet, as well as the Greco-Roman Annotated Research Library, of which I have the core up here, so you'll experience it a little bit, and then a glossary of key biblical terms and concepts, which are topos-based topic statements, which really means they're your starting point for essays or for things that you're going to write in culture, in your own context. So I won't take time to review the sub-things here. Now, I also have a detailed section in here, which I'm going to skip because I want to get the core concepts of this one and a couple slides in session 2, so there's plenty of time to go back and discuss. Because this is the kind of stuff the attention span of whoever's listening isn't as long as some of the other situations, because it's like, that's my 30-second term I don't understand. And so I'm going to try to give you mostly highlights. But in each session, I have kind of tell you a little bit about what's in that session. That one needs a little more work. And I want to tell you a little bit about the journey of how we got there. I'm just going to use one slide, but there's about 8 or 10 slides, so I'm not going to. You can read that through because it's in detail in your session. But here's a very important quote that affected me a lot in 1982. I started seeing Kaiser about 78, and he was a mentor for a long time to me. And one of Kaiser's biggest issues is author's intended meaning. And he kind of is the father in the evangelical side of Old Testament theology. And Kaiser's passion was, we need to rediscover the Old Testament. You can't interpret the New Testament correctly if you don't reattach it to the whole story. You're totally lost without doing that. And so he had toward an exegetical theology, get back to this hermeneutic. Now, just quick summarize for you. Toward an Old Testament theology, which was the schematic for the Old Testament. Toward an Old Testament ethic, which was the theology of the law, actually, from an ethical standpoint. And towards rediscovering, no, that's another one. Towards the use of the Old Testament in the New, how to move back and forth and be able to interpret. And that's really key to a lot of the framework in what we built in the large leadership series, too. But this is one of his quotes out of an article he wrote in Concordia Quarterly in 1982. And the problem is most people don't take these things seriously. Michael was talking this morning about the paradigms and how they move. Well, there are quotes like this in every sphere, saying there's a new paradigm coming, the old paradigm's broken, at this stage. But people then still tweak and make a little renewal, but they don't realize that broken means broken, and the whole thing's got to change. Look what Kaiser says. There is little doubt left in the minds of most leaders in the church of the last half of the 20th century that we are going through a hermeneutical crisis, perhaps as significant in its importance and outcome as that of the Reformation. So what he's saying is hermeneutics is in crisis. We've gone the wrong direction. And so as a result, it's basically grinding to a halt, which is why we can show we're one generation behind Europe, where you have France with 35,000 towns and villages without even an evangelical witness, and we've really entered a post-Christian culture in the U.S. And a lot of it goes back to our hermeneutic, because we're not using the Scripture in Christ's design and for what it was intended to be. And he's one of the pioneers of this. Now, I tell the story in several slides, but let me just show you this. It's kind of helpful. Because of Walter Kaiser and Elliot Johnson wrote books, Elliot Johnson's was Expository Hermeneutics, on getting back to the author's intended meaning. And they created a huge controversy in the seminaries. And just like inerrancy, some of you are old enough to know that there was a International Council of Biblical Inerrancy that was started to deal with the issue of whether the Bible has errors in it or not. And there was a Chicago council that got together, just 100 people. And 50 of them were the Packers of the world, and 50 were people that they invited. Well, because I'd worked with Kaiser and Johnson a lot, I got invited to both of these. And the second one was the Council on Inerrancy. The first one was inerrancy. The second one was biblical statement, the Council of Biblical Hermeneutics, which is laying a foundation for a whole new hermeneutic. And both Elliott, Johnson, and Kaiser had articles in it. So I was able to dialogue for 3 or 4 days with this whole debate in terms of gaining the significance of why this hermeneutic has to change. And as a result, my own work unfolded over the next 20 years with Leadership Series 1 and 2, with especially Interpreting 1 and Interpreting 2, and Toward a Theology and Culture, and Toward a Theology and Civilization. Those framed in the hermeneutic. The first principles, especially Series 3, Handling the Word with Confidence. And then the paradigm papers, Church-Based Theology and Church-Based Hermeneutics. All of those were laying this foundation for the new hermeneutic. And what I mean by that is there are 3 core concepts, not steps. They kind of are, but it's the concepts. They're kind of cyclical in terms of as you're going through, winding up with the literary genre and the anyway. One is a new encyclopedia. The basic idea is biblical theology replaces systematic theology. Second is hermeneutical process, that is author's intended meaning, literary design, and biblical theology. And you'll see that expanded while we go through the Pauline corpus and the new perspective on Paul, where the literary design actually becomes benchmarks for measuring how well the order and process of, and how well your network is established. And biblical theology then begins to take the smaller issues to get the theology solid under them before you do structural things in culture. Then another part of hermeneutics is what we call hermeneutically trained judgment. And then theology in community and in dialogue. And so you become a hermeneutical community. You don't have one expert scientist that's mastered Western academic hermeneutics that gives all the answers to people. It's done in community, in dialogue. So you have to have an apostolic team. You have to have senior elders that can develop a hermeneutically trained judgment. And that's not mechanical linguistics. It's not, you can just look at it inductively, pick the subject up, diagram the sentences, pick up a few Greek words, and you got it. No, it's an integrated process. We had hired Wycliffe, for example, to translate a lot of stuff in Chinese. And now, of course, we got engagement. Renton's leading the whole translation process. But we cannot even, the Chinese leaders ultimately concluded we can't even use this stuff. And the primary reason is the people that are translating. I've argued with Wycliffe since the mid-70s on this. When you come up to the forest, you don't start with the trees. And examine this tree and diagram this one, and then get to the whole that way. You have to walk up to the forest, and you have to look at the contours of it as a whole. And believe it or not, the last 40 years, corpus linguistics is where all of the transformation and action is. You have to understand Paul's corpus first. Then you have to get down to the individual books. And you have to get down to the key literary sections that he outlines. Then you get down to some of the smaller ideas, and only then, if you look up a Greek word and there's 5 possible choices, that you can pick the right choice that fits into the corpus as a whole. And you go through Bible translation. Today, you go through a lot of the stuff we had translated for Wycliffe, and they picked the wrong dumb word almost every time. when it becomes significance, incommensurability. Because they got to translate it into something that people can understand, which they understand, which means they don't understand what they're trying to translate so people can understand. And so you wind up with nonsense. Okay, so this was our framework. Now, the encyclicals and the Mastering the Scriptures series have led me down a path, led all of us down a path of looking at this hermeneutics from another level, a deeper level, what's called the new perspective on Paul, the apostolic traditioning process. Because we've always said these are tools for establishing churches. You've seen the diagrams of that. But how do you really use them as tools for establishing churches? How do you know that what all the churches had to practice, Paul said, from what he gave them from the traditioning process in 1 Corinthians 11, how do you know that which things are that and whether they're for today? And so because see, we're walking into those letters not from the academy and the Western theological disparate conversations of the last 400 years particularly, but we're walking in with fresh networks of churches, which is why Paul wrote them, and actually why Petrine Circle authors wrote them, and why John wrote them. Remember, even the book of Revelation, when you think about it, what's he do? He starts off with the 7 churches. Who are the 7 churches? They're the core churches of Achaia that were part of Paul's core network that he was stabilizing everything with when he got out of prison the last 6 years before he died. So you can see the whole pathway, but that's not how we go at it. So people will say all the time, I've been to seminary, I've gone through all kinds of stuff. When I took the Acts course, it changed everything. Never have I seen that. Why have they not seen it? Because it isn't taught that way. It's taught as history lessons, even in China, where the first half, where the great house church movements grew up, they stopped in Acts 12 primarily. So they think Paul was mean and Barnabas was good, and they follow Peter in devotion to the apostles' doctrine, fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayer. But they thought the last half of Acts, this is almost across the board, the last half of Acts was history lessons and stories. Well, when you get actually into our Western seminaries, all of Acts is history lessons and stories. And so it's like, how can you go through all of that training, 8 years, and not see Acts correctly? Because the hermeneutic is wrong. And that's why it's so important for us to go back to this. Now, there's 4 concepts. I skipped all the story and everything. I would give you these 4 concepts as quickly as possible. Then we're going to talk about the order of the canonical order of things with just a couple slides in the second session. So we got a lot of time for discussion and maybe some exercises in your booklet. 4 core hermeneutical concepts on the new perspective on Paul. Now, there's a lot of debate on the new perspective on Paul. N.T. Wright was one of the key people that brought the evangelical side of the new perspective on Paul forward. It started out as liberal, primarily, although really, really sharp stuff from E.P. Sanders. The Catholics picked it up, and now somebody like N.T. Wright has picked it up and moved it forward. And of course, the Reformed theology people are arguing virtually that N.T. Wright is apostate and screws up the gospel. And every conversation I've ever been in with anybody along this line, they've never really read N.T. Wright, his big works. But I'm not here to defend N.T. Wright, and the reason is because N.T. Wright actually went back and got the gospel correct, but he doesn't understand the church. He goes right to the kingdom, and he stays an Anglican, and so but it's an important part of the body of work that is redoing hermeneutics. So the things we're after is 4 ideas. One is the new hermeneutic. Paul, a coherent thinker. Absolutely foundational. Nobody in Western systematic theology thinks of Paul as a coherent thinker. They see it as kind of some elementary things and got us started the right direction, but down through the centuries, we built theology, we built systematic theology, and now we can see clearly. That's how it's held. That's how it's viewed. But he was a coherent thinker. Second is topoi as clustering, What in the world is topi? Well, that you'll be really clear by the end of session 5. But basically, well, I won't even say it now. We're going to look at overarching subsections and asides. Then the actual apostolic traditioning process of Paul, where you move from schemas to principles to process to practices. This is particularly important because once our churches are set in order, like that 5-year and 5-year, and we're building ministries, outreach ministries, all kinds of ministries within our church, we don't build ministries consistent with the paradigm. And so it's very difficult to build a youth ministry and keep it in the paradigm because of the paradigm that's out there. It's very difficult to build some kind of women's ministry when all the big women ministries out there, you got to bar the doors and not get them in because they'll absolutely screw up the paradigm. And so you go through ministry after ministry that's a result of our, like you were saying, as a result of our fragmented church going to seminary and going to mission agencies and so on. All those things have to be rethought. And you have to build them carefully at a practical level. And so you learn to do that with this. And then no theology of Paul. Papers, documents in culture, no academic textbooks. In other words, people say, okay, so maybe Jeff's going to write a New Testament theology. Or maybe a New Testament theology of Paul. And what I'm going to argue for, which comes actually from Luke Timothy Johnson, is no theology of Paul. Nobody is good enough to write a complete biblical theology of Paul. You have to start within what he reveals, that apostolic teaching, and you have to work through the issues that are, and you can get the framework in place. You can take many of the main literary designs and use them as a framework and benchmarks, but you got to actually do the same process. It's got to stay living. You can't anchor it into a textbook. No theology of Paul. Sounds really bad. Okay. I'm going to skip all this part of the story, too. This is in a lot of stuff, but it's worth touching base back here for a moment. In doing theology and culture, and well, first learning to think biblically, these are the designs behind the First Principles series and the design behind the original Leadership series. In other words, you start with the reading and studying of the teaching, the apostolic belief, the framework of the way of Christ and the apostles, the stories, the letters, the letters. Then you think, and all this is done dialogue and community. You think through the issues and implications for yourself, for your family, for your church, for the life in the world around. And then you build a response, decisions, personal habits, projects. You keep going round and round that. And when you do it through the 3 series of the First Principles, you know, you've got a pretty good foundation. But then you got to think bigger, and that is, how do you do theology in a culture? This is Leadership Series 1 and 2. Here, building a framework from Scripture, the meta stories, books of the Bible, biblical theology. Then you start thinking through systematic cultural issues and categories, papers, courses, develop ministries, and you frame in theology for a civilization. You begin your own body of work, and then there are always a few people in a civilization that body of work rises and is some of the most influential. But it's still got to be there. Every generation has to redo it. Now, that kind of, and then, also an example of what we mean by papers that are done in culture then. See, we ran into a situation, like Michael was saying, where it's clear that the expectation of the Western donor world is business boards and corporate structures, not a bunch of church-based yo-yos from Iowa. You know, I mean, this thing's got to be handled professionally. So we went through the pressure of the second generation. You either do that or you're out. We're not going to fund you. Well, they quit funding us because we weren't out. But what Michael did was he went back, because he was pressed with having to give the primary response. He went back to 2 Timothy, particularly, where you build intergenerational leadership. And it's not a business board replacing a business board. Everybody's out, and the new head football coach is taking it a different direction. No, And so he demonstrates why that's the wrong way to think, and then laid it out carefully for all of us in terms of what's wrong with Western corporate boards and why that has to change. Not accountability, but why it has to change. Now, I'm not going to tell this story either about rewriting things because of the encountering of N.T. Wright. You can read all of that. But here's the 4 concepts, and I'll look at each one briefly. One is a new hermeneutic, Paul as a coherent thinker. A new perspective of Paul. Paul was a coherent thinker, clear, logical, integrated through his whole corpus, who did theology and culture amongst his churches within the framework of that fully integrated and historical narrative of his day. He used organizing centers, theological core topoi, that were dense and cyclical, with many integrated topics in one place and concept, like the church being a family of families as the organizing piece in the 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus. There's not endless topics there, but there's a set of core topics that are integrated that you can't understand one separate from the other. That were dense and cyclical, many integrated topics in one place or concept to enable the future churches at any time and anywhere, that's us, to do similar theology and culture. Paul's topoi make us the essence of Christ's grand strategy, and his letters form a coherent, interlocking shape that is foundational for churches in any generation to understand that Christ's grand strategy for the unfolding kingdom in his church and to live in full alignment with that grand strategy. Now, the key authors, E.P. Sanders, liberal, and many consider the foundation of New Perspective on Paul. I love how Sanders goes through the intention of books, by the way. A lot of respect for him. N.T. Wright, Anglican evangelical, first evangelical to make major work in evangelical circles on the New Perspective on Paul, but really doesn't understand the church. And Luke Timothy Johnson, a Catholic theologian, recently producing the 2-volume canonical Paul, which is absolutely phenomenal work. And these are the books. And just a couple quotes, again. It's so important to do this fairly fast. The Old Perspective on Paul, a Sanders quote, Paul was a coherent but not systematic thinker, like systematic theology since the Reformation, where Sanders says Paul sees Paul as a theological thinker with a coherent viewpoint. Johnson, they have been taught that has been abstracted from certain dialogues and arranged in a logical system that is nowhere to be found as such as in the dialogues of Plato, as in the dialogues themselves. In other words, the dialogue is taken out, the story is taken out, and you just have these individual concepts that become what you actually study. And a lot of them are built around a specific theological word, and they've destroyed the word, so from an incommensurability standpoint, you can't use that word anymore. Whereas Johnson says, whereas they actually begin to read the dialogues in all their particularity and complexity, they begin to discover how much exciting and challenging thought has escaped the usual categories, the reductionistic categories of systematic theology. And Wright says, speaking of the old perspective, that theology is not just bits and pieces, miscellaneous topi, which just happen to turn up in these irrelevant contingent contexts like oddly shaped pearls on an irrelevant string. And he says instead, the more time we spend in the careful reading of Paul, in the study of his worldview, in his theology and his aims and intentions, the more he emerges as a deeply coherent thinker. His main themes may not well fit into the boxes constructed by later Christian dogmatics of whatever type. They generate their own categories, and they keep generating them as you encounter your unique cultural situations, generation by generation. So my summaries are, the old perspective on Paul, and this is why systematic theology is so damaging, Paul's letters contain miscellaneous, often unrelated topics that would be useful for future believers, especially in dealing with sin and salvation and living the Christian life. These topics are a significant part of today's ever-growing systematic theologies. That will not establish churches, that will not train leaders. New perspective on Paul. Paul was a coherent thinker who did theology in culture among his churches from a framework of fully integrated historical narrative and densely cyclical centers. It enables us to do similar theology amongst our churches today, and together they make up Christ's grand strategy. The old perspective is that Paul was a systematic theologian like Calvin. Actually, most of them, no, I do say that, but contained unsystematized doctrine that could be systemized by future theologians. But his thought was not organized or fully developed or fully logical. Therefore, it must be clear and made clearer and clearer by highly skilled Western systematic theologians. That's the underlying framework. On top of that, the missionaries come along. So now we got professional theologians. We can't get along without them. But let's create another profession. Let's create missionaries as professionals. So because the theology, Western theology, won't move across culture, they designed contextualization and decontextualization. So you have to learn how to decontextualize the literature of the West, of the theology of the West, and recontextualize it in culture. But the reality is Scripture moves right across culture, if you're interpreting it correctly. So now we have another profession on top of it. And I won't read these quotes, but you can see here that Sanders, Paul was a coherent, not systematic thinker. Paul was a theological thinker with a coherent viewpoint. N.T. Wright, to the texts themselves, he did them to argue a coherent and careful case. They have a coherent, interlocking shape. They shed light on, positive light, on passage after passage of tricky exegesis. In other words, all those debates that grind us to a halt in Romans or grind us to a halt in Hebrews, when you're interpreting it correctly, you slide right through those debates because you're not starting with the fragmentation of either side. And Paul deliberately laid out whole arguments, not bits and pieces or miscellaneous topoi, and he emerges as a deeply coherent thinker. Now, a second thing, topoi as clustering, overarching subsections and asides. Topos is common topics in one place, and is a very important Greek form of rhetoric that enables one to structure an argument that includes several topics around one memorable thematic or rubric, literally in one place. A plural of topos is topoi. Now, this is probably almost the hardest one to get a hold of, topos-based topic statements. These are often long statements or short paragraphs that summarize a key concept using a form of Greek rhetoric of Paul's day. It is sort of a topic, but not an isolated topic. It's a topic related to an organizing center. Now, think of the household structure in Paul's later letters that cannot be understood fully independent of the main organizing center. The topos-based topic statement, topos-based topic statements very much relate to the new perspective on Paul and the hermeneutic of Paul being a coherent thinker. In other words, well, we'll give illustrations later, so I won't mess with it now. But another important concept is in Tight's book, Valentinian Ethics and Hermenetic Discourse, around topoi clustering. And what happens is, in this whole thing, you cluster an idea. So let's say you're talking about the church being a family of families. And particularly 1 Timothy is the organizing center for 1st, 2nd Timothy, and Titus. How you should conduct yourself in a household of God. How you build fully establish the network. So that's all laid out. But they'll deal with individual. So there's a key section in most of them, like the gathering, is a key section in 1 Corinthians 11:17 to 14:40. So that's like the schema of the gathering. But in there's subsections of material, but there's also asides. He talks about the gathering and taking the bread incorrectly earlier in, he touches on it once in 1 Corinthians 5 and once in 1 Corinthians 10. So you pull all that together, but there's always an organizing center that's always taught to us by the central literary structures within the letters that were written. And so you build out from there. Overarching material, subsections. We'll give you very practical examples, and we take you all and show you how this happens again and again and again, all the way through Paul's letters, all the way through the Petrine Circle letters. I already stated this on the gathering, so I'll skip it. Apostolic traditioning of Paul. This is a phrase that refers to Paul's process of establishing churches that sets a Pauline tradition to be handed down to the future churches. This was a unique part of the apostolic stewardship of revealing Christ's grand strategy, regardless of history, time, and culture. A process that includes following Paul's schema, principles, processes, and practices. Now, what do I mean by that? Take the gathering again. The schema, the overall arching topos, the framework, is the Lord's Supper followed by the symposium. When you gather together, here's the Lord's Supper. When you come back together, here's the symposium. And so that becomes the organizing center of everything that happens in that whole section. Then you've got, what in the world? 1 Corinthians 12 and 13. Well, you got gifts, and you've got love, and they're all built around a set of principles that help you understand how gifts work and why love is superior. Well, when you tie it back into then the symposium afterwards, it's very clear that there's a giftedness that we all have. You have to take the unseemly ones and allow them to be exalted. And there's an order of apostle, prophet, and teacher that keeps order in the community while it's an open community. So those two are a set of principles that fit right in the center of topoi. Now, you can apply them different ways, but you can't leave their original intent. And so this is part of the traditioning process. So what Paul was doing here is he says, I told you all about the Lord's Supper before. Now you come together for a big meal, you're separate, you're fighting, you're eating unworthily. There's complete chaos in your meeting, the second half, and so the gifts are, the signed gifts or the fancy gifts are all over the place, and he'd rather speak one word of prophetic edification as the churches are maturing. And so they're all designed to solve those, to give a cluster of the principles in the context of this. But then you also have processes. When you come together, let each one bring a teaching, a song. He's not giving an exact list. He's describing a process. And then you say there are practices, though, where you need to do this. And one of the key practices, there aren't many of them, but one of the practices, when you're doing the Lord's Supper, you begin with the bread, and you finish with the cup. A lot of flexibility in that whole meal, but that practice you don't drop. That's a specific practice. Now, this is, no theology of Paul is the last one. This is interesting. This comes from Luke Timothy Johnson's work. He's a Catholic. It's just unbelievably good research. And without reading the quote again, it's what he says basically in this whole section. Oh, I guess that's the second to the last slide. So I can anticipate the disappointment of the reader who has approached a volume called Interpreting Paul, which is the second volume, expecting a full magisterial treatment of Paul's thought. Such books are frequently fly under the banner of Paul's theology. To find instead only a set of discrete essays that do not in the least provide or even pretend to provide a comprehensive construction of all that may seem to the reader a form of dereliction of duty. Why didn't you write a theology? It's my apparent failure to launch a symptom of scholarly fatigue. In other words, I'm 76, or worse, theological ineptitude, I can't do it, or I'm a coward. Such signs of age or intellectual and moral decline may indeed be present in your author, but my refusal to offer something like a theology of Paul, a refusal that has been implicit in all my work from the start, is instead, and so I think, based on a principled stand that not only the impossibility of anyone responsibly accomplishing such a task, but it is also the positive damage done to the reading of the canonical letters by the very attempt to carry out the task. You wreck the fresh reading. And so if you were to go through his work here on it's a very, very interesting piece. It's got, I think, 27 articles in here, essays. And he kind of walks through important topics in the early, middle, and later letters. And so this is real live stuff that can be put, and I'll give you some examples as we go along. And that is the kind of thing that keeps the right foundation there, but everybody doing this kind of process fresh in your own cultural situation. Now, I got to do a couple things. I'm going to skip this. This is too big. Basically, I'm saying you got to run this now, understand the system, then you got to run it through the theology in your churches, theology in networks, and theology in civilizations. So I'm following that same simple line, but showing how it reinvents everything, including publishing houses. Okay, I need my second one, and I'm just going to reduce it to a couple slides on the second one. So we got time here. Session 2. Same slide. Remember, this is kind of our front-end engine, same outline. I'm not going to do that again. The review, these are the two sets. This is all I did in session 1. New Theological Encyclopedia, hermeneutical process, hermeneutical community, and then the new perspective on Paul and how to begin this process of actually now using them to establish our churches through Paul's traditioning process. Now, in this session, we're going to deal with the canonical structure and the new perspective on Paul. There's the Pauline corpus, which are his main books. There's the Gospels that you have to figure out how they relate. The early letters and the Gospels and the Jewish epistles. I don't know what I was doing there. Jeepers. Okay, did Paul write the entire Pauline corpus, all 13 letters? How does the chronology of the writing of the letters affect the process of establishing churches in the New Testament canon? How do the canonical sections and the letters themselves relate to one another? Why do we view Paul's letters as foundational to the understanding of the New Testament canon? And how do Paul's letters form a theology of each canonical section and eventually frame in the entire canon, the entire New Testament, shaping churches to do theology in their own cultures? Now, again, there's just too much here. I did a nice summary at this point, and I did a lot of work on it because a lot of the Greco-Roman scholarship starts with a liberal base, and most of them assume that there were 3 letters that were inauthentic, 1st and 2nd Timothy, Titus, and several of the middle ones may be authentically written by Paul, but primarily, mostly the first ones were written by Paul. But I established the case here. It's very important to establish it because I'm sending you into reading into a body of Greco-Roman literature where a lot of the literature assumes those 3 fragmentations of Paul. They were all written as one coherent, by one person as coherent thinking, and so I delve into that and give you ways to go after it. Now, Chronology Matters, a very interesting book, was written in 2022, Rethinking the Dates of the New Testament. Very extensive work, and I show you his range and where I wound up. And again, this is how I see. Where's the long list? Oh, shoot. Okay, I'll do this. Mine is in parentheses. Galatians written in 49, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians in 51, 1st and Corinthians 53, 56, Romans 56, Ephesians, Colossians, Philemon, and Philippians written in 60 to 62 in prison. Luke probably was written during that time or sometime after it, but clearly before he joined Paul in 68 or 67 with Timothy and John Mark and Luke. Timothy was written 63 or 64. No, I'm messing up here. Was written autumn of 62 or 63. Titus, summer of 66. Autumn of 67, 2 Timothy, and Paul was beheaded in the spring of 68. So that's basically the order. Now, the significance of this means that Paul's early letters were 49 to 67, and the Gospels were 60 to 69, and the Synoptics, and John was 85 to 95. The Catholic epistles are 85 to 95, which I treat them as 2 sets, the Petrine Circle, 60 to 69, in the Johannine literature, 85 to 95. Now, you're going to see that, well, again, we won't do anything more than look at the implications here. The rest of the books of the New Testament, well, I'm not even going to do that. You don't need that right now. So, mastering, let's see, Petrine. Okay, it's best to just visualize it. The way we've solved it, think of that chronology, is here's Paul's early letters, and his middle letters, and his later letters. But we put the first book on the Gospels here, that surveys all the Gospels, and then put Luke, Acts here. So you're reading Luke, Acts with the collection of Paul. And we know they worked together on that because Luke was very accurate, but when Paul said, bring me the scrolls and I'm going to die in the spring, and he had the big powwow in the fall of 67, Luke was there, John Mark was there, who was key to a lot of the writing and the pulling together of the Petrine Circle stuff, and Timothy was there, and Paul. And a lot of things were pulled together at that time. So you actually read then, when you get to Paul's later letters here, then you get to the Petrine Circle letters, James, 1 Peter, 2 Peter, 2 Peter and Jude, and Hebrews. I can't read them. Then we put Mark and Matthew here. We recommend Mark first because Mark's the kerygma in its simplest form, and Matthew follows the same form and gives you a lot of color into the Old Testament. But both of them are written to the Jewish churches, so you study them at that time. Then when you get, and these are all done, by the way, this next week we finish, and then it's a matter of editing them extensively for most of a year, and then this collection will all be available next year at this time. And then Johannine, I finished this week, but we read John. We put John right in the center of the Johannine literature. Then you have John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Revelation. So actually the canonical structure matches the unfolding, gives you insight into the establishing process, and puts the Gospels in their context as tools for solidifying the Gospel itself. Now, well, also what's important is the issue of what order do you read them in? Well, this is the section out of our new 3.0 bachelor's or master's degree and master's certificate. You have to study teaching, mastering the Scriptures, and then the Pauline corpus in book early letters, survey all of the early letters, book 1, 1 Corinthians, 2 Corinthians, middle letters, book 2, later letters, all of them, and then 2 Timothy, and then Jesus to the Gospels and Mark. Because this lays the foundation for all the rest of the mastering the Scriptures. The reason why we do this is series 3 of the first principles. You learn how to interpret Acts then, and then an early, middle, later letter of Paul. Then the problem, one of the biggest problems that comes up is apostolic authority and apostolic teams. Very, very difficult to get that across to people. We spent a year doing that with the Chinese leaders, and it's really happening at this stage. But Paul in 1 Corinthians, and especially 2nd, but in 1 Corinthians and 2 Corinthians, he's solving divisions within the church using the apostolic tradition and the apostolic authority, and he defends his apostolic authority in second one. And then he says that, Timothy, I'm passing that apostolic authority on to you. And you do the same thing to the churches. And use the letters for the same thing and keep that habit and process going. So some say survey book 1, book 2, book 1 of middle, early, middle, and later letters and go to the others. But what we've done in the China situation particularly is it was critical that they get the apostolic idea solid, and so they'll go back and do these. But practically speaking, when you study the whole thing, you want to study them in this order. Early, middle, later, with the Gospels, Petrine here, Johannine here, to build your systematic base. But because of this tool and this guide, which you'll learn how to use more extensively this week, you can take anything out of here and next year out of here, because you'll do a comprehensive assessment of your network. And whatever problems, it'll show you where the issues are dealt with and where to go, and you can do your own work in that, that lesson. Okay. Yeah, I'm done. I'm done. You want to go right to questions, or you want to?
I've had my back to everybody, so I can sometimes see how people are processing by their body language. So let me look across the room for 12 seconds and do my own assessment. Yeah, okay. I saw 3 of you on the edge of your chairs.
And the way we usually do this on Sunday morning is then when I sit down, I'll say, because Michael does the intro, the beginning, and the end of a book with me, and then he has other guys up here the other times. But the first question I ask is something like, Michael, you've gone over and over and over this stuff, over and over this. What'd you learn? What stands out on this one?
Well, do you want to do that, or are you just giving that as an example?
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay.
Let's do it. Unless you just learn nothing.
Yeah, well,
then
I hope not.
It's not going to work.
Yeah, right. I think one thing that I picked up on this time was the whole idea of Paul, the whole base of we need a whole new hermeneutic from Kaiser. I've never seen that quote from Kaiser. Never seen that quote. That's a powerful quote. You remember last year we interviewed Kaiser on Zoom. It was a recording from Zoom, but it was like 45 minutes, and we got it down to like 16 minutes. Just the whole crises of the hermeneutic that we're in. I think go back to the 3 S curves and and different paradigms that are a emerging paradigm that's happening today. How is it going to be shaped? Well, we better get the hermeneutics right if it's going to be shaped right. And then I think the other thing that struck me this time was this whole topoi and topos, that Paul has an argument, an organizing center. So I'm thinking Romans 16, 20, 24, 25, 26, 23, something like that. The last couple verses, he says, now, like a conclusive now, I've established you in my gospel and the gospel of Jesus Christ. I've given it to you. And he's making a definitive statement like that. That's his topos statement, and everything else is this cluster of stars, a constellation around it. To me, I envisioned like a complex network, and his hub is his topoi. You have to be a little careful there of mixing too much in there, but it makes you think of his middle letters is Ephesians 3. He's got that topos, that the Christ, or rather the church, is how the manifold wisdom of God is going to be made known, and he's been given the administration of that. And so when it comes to answering questions about the gathering and cultures and different things, you can right away go to the topos. Your brains, your minds should be going towards all the questions that you have. You should be able to go to the topos, and then be able to go to the sections, how Paul does his corpus, because you showed us his early, middle, and later letters, which we've been talking a lot about, but through the years, and so that's not new, the whole early, middle, and later letters, but I think what is new in it is the whole idea of there's an organizing topos in it, and everything is connected to that. So as soon as you take one piece, one argument, if you don't see that argument inside of his whole argument, you're left with this just dangling pearl out here in no man's land, and it's not really that helpful.
And I think the new perspective on Paul takes it out of the academic step by step and into actually the process that allows you to get that and be thinking it as you're trying to establish your churches. And so I think the new part of it is the fact that that's a much clearer way of communicating the process that's supposed to be going on. You got to do the discipline of author's intent, literary design, and so on. But really, you got to learn to just think with a hermeneutically trained judgment. And that's really what is much clearer to understand, articulate, with some of the understanding some of that literary stuff.
But it takes so many years to get to that. I think to that point, and that's for all of you. You've got to go through the hard work of getting to that point. You skated over it intentionally, but I think the other thing that's just clear to me how all the pieces of the puzzle fit together, and that is author's intent and literary design. We're going to talk more about that, especially as we move through the guide, but I guess I was impacted again, just how you can make sense. I remember as a young kid thinking, with all these sermons and all these Sunday school stories that seemed like I'm never going to be able to make sense of the Bible. Like it just seems hopeless. And all these battles about when do you baptize, and if it's salvific, if you baptize somebody, and are you predestined or do you have free will, or all these debates. And what's the role of women anyway?
Michael was raised Reformed, if you don't know.
And so you get into all these debates that just are endless and they just leave you with, you throw your hands up in the air and say, there's no way for you to figure it out. And so you end up being, I think the product that you end up being really passionate about things that aren't central, or you become lukewarm. I think that's the alternatives. And I guess with author's intent and literary design, when you can see all of Paul's letters and see his arguments and his big arguments, and then you can see all of Peter's letters and all of the Petrine Circle written to the diaspora, and the gospel books, Mark and Matthew, fit into that. That's why Matthew is doing all of that stuff. It's written to the Jewish diaspora churches that are in Acts 2 when they dispersed. Well, duh. Of course that makes sense now, what Matthew is. Of course Hebrews. Hebrews is such a huge elephant that nobody can get their hands around, but you go through it now with the whole framework of this hermeneutic, and you can get your hands around the 5 exhortations in Hebrews. And you can see, he says, I can't talk to you about Melchizedek because you're too immature. You cannot handle it. All you can do is drink milk. That's all I can do. You can't understand how Melchizedek was actually a foreshadowing of a new hypodigma, a new paradigm. Now I'm droning on here a little bit, but I'm just excited because I feel like I can get my hands around Hebrews. And I feel like I can use Hebrews in building complex apostolic networks. I feel like I can do it because you have to build an apostolic team that has a complex state of mind. And that is dealing with actually conflicts without and fears within.
And particularly in
That's
really
exciting.
adverse, difficult cultural situations.
When you're put to the death. I ain't talking about feeling uncomfortable in your culture. I'm talking about death. I mean, I just think we are at a. I sit there in this last little bit, and it's exciting. I think we live in exciting days. And I think it's fun. It's a lot of work. I don't think everybody's going to make it. That's a harsh reality. But I think it's fun. I think it's a lot of fun. It's rewarding work. And I want to talk about Hebrews.
Talk about what?
I want to talk about Hebrews because after seeing that, I'm just impacted more by Hebrews right now. But,
next conference.
Next conference, yes. Okay. I didn't think I had anything to say, but those are a few of my thoughts.
You know, I think it would be good. I imagine we need to take a break.
Yeah, what time?
You know, breaks are tools of Satan to break up your thought. But I think rather than questions, what do you think? Maybe we should let them discuss at tables a little bit. I'd like to hear them articulate their own experience going through this hermeneutic and why that's been important in their story or something like that. Or we could just handle clarified questions. Actually, I don't care.
Let's do clarifying questions first. So, and then we'll take a break. So we promise we will give you a break. But let's answer some clarifying questions yet. We just went through a lot of stuff. First level is to seek understanding. So what are some clarifying questions? What parts do you not understand that you want to ask about?
I'm having fun.
Clarifying questions. Raise your hand if you understood everything that was. No, that's not to do that. Because if you didn't understand everything, then you have a question.
It's kind of like drinking from a fire hose, isn't it? Something like this.
Whatever water did not get consumed, ask something about that. Typically takes one or two questions to get it going, so thanks, Thinagrid.
I met with kind of a negative statement regarding the new perspective of Paul to at least 3 places that Bill is deviating their basic understanding.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's, but really I know the answer also. It's not a new perspective, as you are saying, that's an original perspective. But most of the questions that are the 3 people, they are from Reformed theological position. Mm-hmm. So would you please give me a little more substantial case that I can even boldly talk with them?
That's a good question.
Yeah, I think I can't give you a more substantial case because when you read this carefully, it's outstanding. It wins the argument. All right. But let me emphasize a couple things you should note in there. When we're talking about the new perspective on Paul, and Reformed are criticizing it, you got to clarify. That's why in parentheses it says original Paul. With Reformed people, I go right through the front door. You know, in other words, do you think Paul is a coherent thinker? Do you think there's a design across all the letters? Do you think that Paul was really not a very good theologian, but a fragmented guy, and theologians need to develop it? Get them to put their position on the table. But a second thing is the story. Say that what we're doing is reattaching Paul to the story. And you look through systematic theology, Western systematic theology, Reformed theology, the theology is detached from the story. And Paul is detached from the story. Even though I really wish N.T. Wright would have gotten the church correct. He did go after the story, and he did go after the gospel into the story. But the second thing, there's a little book, I'll try to remember to bring it tomorrow. I put these books up here because in the appendix, there's a core library of Greco-Roman research. This opens the door to almost everything that exists over the last 40 years. And we'll show you how to use it, and it's all available mostly on Logos, or electronic format. But if you go back to Kaiser for a moment, Kaiser wrote a little book in 217 called, is it The Jewish Family? It's not very big, 110 so pages, whatever. But he defines how, because see, a lot of Reformed, the reason why they've detached it from the story so much is they believe that the Jewish people missed it, and they're done, and there is no continuing promise that relates in any way to the Jewish people, so they stopped the story at that point. Church history is the only story, forward. And because they detach Paul from the story, I think that, anyway, what Kaiser does there is he shows that Paul made a very clear case in Romans 9 to 11 that don't you become arrogant like the Jews and think they failed and that God gave the promise to you because you're great people. No, he says, be respectful of the Jewish people because God gave them the promise and he loved them and we're grafted in. Now, for the times of the Gentiles, they're kind of on the shelf and God's going to reach them. But keep your attitude right. Well, what Kaiser does is he demonstrates up until the Reformation, the Christian church persecuted the Jews. Almost every single generation. And the worst persecution before Hitler came from Reformed theologians and Luther's whole statement that basically just armbands everything. So the Reformed people disassociate Paul from the story. And when Paul's disassociated from the story, then you can arrange things any way you want. And they think they're defending the gospel because they've got word after word after word, predestination, all the different words filled with books of stuff, and they're the only ones that have the gospel right. And when you get into N.T. Wright, you begin to realize the gospel on a continuum. Peter didn't even understand the gospel clearly, clear up to Galatians 2, the implications of it in the church. He had the core gospel, the kerygma statement right. So there's a progression, and you have to treat the clarity of all the gospel questions being answered primarily when Paul gets to the last one of his early letters, and he says, now I've established you in my faith. And so you take the context away from the story, and you take the story of Christ's administration now into that story that can only be understood as a revelation that was foreshadowed in the story. And so I don't think, if you've ever listened to Ali talk about how the story is transformational as far as evangelism with the Jewish people, I think the story is almost where the battle has to begin with Reformed. But, we're pretty successful at winning arguments, and that sounds bad. That's two bad statements. One is, it's an outstanding section, read it, But it's like that. It's the most difficult system for us to break through, because I don't want to attach it to they're bad people, but they're trapped in a paradigm. The most difficult system for us to break through with these things is Reformed, everywhere in the world. That's all I can give you.
Thank you so much, Dad. I never thought of that, how to put it into the story.
Are you hoping I can hear you?
Check. Yeah, thank you so much that even though I debate with them on the coherent thinker and the no theology of Paul, but this is a new piece that you have given, that how to put inside the story rather than breaking it is really meaningful. Thanks.
Yeah, and where they'll go that the story was stopped, more or less. It's church history now. Then you got to make the case, now look. And that's where Kaiser's book, he goes right up, all through church history, comes right up to the Reformation and nails Reformed theology. That's where the problem lies.
It's a great question. It does. I know I'm going to sound like a broken record right now, but
It's hard to, what's that?
the fourth literary section of Hebrews answers part of that too. Because he says you can't forget the story, and he ties it all back to the story in the fourth exhortation in Hebrews. Talks about Melchizedek. In session 3, exhortation 3 of Hebrews, he says you can't handle the milk, and you need to be eating solid food, eat solid meat, but you won't be able to handle it. And then in exhortation 4, he tells them about Melchizedek. Even though the previous one he says, I'm not going to tell you because you can't handle it. Melchizedek was a foreshadow of the paradigm. What else? Let's take one more before we break. Let's see where else are you processing. Josephat, are you getting up to go to no?
It's probably kind of fearful to wander in. This is the deep end, and you can take in water with a bad question. See, I was right. Discussing at the tables and shaking each other up.
All right. Take a break. We'll come back in a little bit and have next plans for you. We'll call you back in. Yeah. Okay. A few thoughts emerged over break. You got yours on? Is yours microphone? Your microphone's not on. No, your microphone.
It's not on?
No, evidently not.
So then they can't hear me.
Right.
There, testing.
Yep. Okay, you had a conversation about corpus linguistics? That sounds amazing.
I wanted to start us off. Are there still people out there? Can somebody go yell at them? Because anything short of that doesn't seem to work. George, Curian, right, or something like that? Yeah, I was close. He asked the question, is corpus linguistics a term I just made up, or is it used? All right, and I want to share the illustration just because it shows again how out of touch Western theological education is. Corpus linguistics has been developing for 40 years. Some of the experts are Chinese because of one belt and one road strategy. They want to be able to go back as they're moving across the globe and pick up 1,000 years old Chinese classics and show how they're a unified thought. And so they develop corpus linguistics to show the unity of that thought all the way through. But it's been developing in linguistics for a long time. So did I just make it up? No, this is Routledge Handbook of Corporate Linguistics, second edition, representing hundreds of corporate linguistic books, research articles, and projects. And it isn't even on the radar of seminaries and translation groups like Wycliffe. But it solves all kinds of linguistic problems. Now, it just happened to be because of Kaiser and Authors Intent and Literary Design, we started with the corpus and worked down. But I discovered this 30 years into the work on it because it's nowhere. And then you say, well, but it's part of something larger, which is systemic functional linguistics. And so systemic functional linguistics started by saying you have to go back to the large literary genre sections in a work to be able to understand the functioning of that larger literary section in the document that it's in. before you can do your sentence diagramming and everything. But they didn't go all the way to corpus on this. And then this one, these are just secular tools, about $175 to $225 each. The Rutledge Handbook on Translation and Methodology, which shows that this fundamentally changes how we do translation, fundamentally changes how we do Bible translation. Evangelicals are not even in the conversation, let alone anywhere near the cutting edge. And that's just an illustration, again, of how once we're locked into a system, it's almost like you can't get out. You're trapped by it. Mm-hmm. But anyway, I thought that was, because I could say, George, how can you not know that? It's been around 40 years. There's big books on it, articles, everything. How can you not know that? That's the question I ask myself. How could I not know that when this is, this has been around? Mm-hmm. I kind of got an attitude about that, so that's why I did my little spiel on it.
All right, here's an idea. Here's what I think would be beneficial for us. Why don't you, at your tables, and you can shift to a table if there's only one of you, or two of you is fine too. You can move around if you wish, but talk at your tables. And I know it, again, we know it was a fire hose, but just open it up and pick one of the 4 or 8 topics that we talked about, or look at your notes. Maybe narrow it down to one item we talked about, and talk at your tables, if you can, then about why that is important for this paradigm of the way of Christ and his apostles. Why might that one be important? One of those 8, one of the 4. I'm just giving you a jumping off point. So why would this particular item be important for us to talk about? Why a new perspective on Paul? Why would that be important for us? Or maybe you want to take on the whole Paul's corpus of understanding his early, middle, and later letters. Why would that be important for this paradigm of the way of Christ and his apostles? So just pick one. If you really want to pick more, you can, but that's a guideline for you.
And let me add to it, as you're asking that question, then ask why does this concept, how does this concept relate to why the materials work? Because all of you have experienced first principles working, acts working. So this concept, how does it contribute to, why the materials work? Because these concepts are why they work.
Okay, so talk about at your tables. We'll call you, we'll cease the conversation here in 15, 20 minutes, and then we'll get feedback from your table about some things you talked about. Okay? All right, go to it.
You think people are
Who's got the microphone? James, you want to do the mic, or Zach? Zach's got it. All right, so just bring us, you can talk to us about anything. Talk to us about, I'll give you a couple ideas, jumping off points, but you can talk to us about, summarize what you talked about at your table. You can share with us some of the questions you talked about. You can talk to us just about the particular aspect of this that you centered on. Right over here, Zach, right here, up front. George?
Continuing with that corpus linguistics idea, so the Bible translators, if all of them were from a Western paradigm, and did not see the corpus linguistics concept, then what we have is, I don't want to say anything after that. Would this be compromised then?
Very much, very much. I think that there are so many passages when you get into places like Romans. Mostly I use the New RSV when I put it in there because it stays the most neutral. But in Romans and even the Gospels, the early letters, I used N.T. Wright's translation of the New Testament. And even then, I don't think he goes near far enough. See, there's so many words, because he's rethinking, to deal with Galatians and Romans. That's 90% of his work. And, but he continues on with Christendom words in most of the other aspects of any translation. And I think that many of the words that are in there, even salvation in a lot of cases, there's a range of choices of the word, and I disagree again and again and again. That's why when you start going through MTS, I don't get into Greek and Hebrew because I don't want too much, except what I do after we get down to some, the framework is all there. The canonical, the corpus, the intent of books, the literary section, is that the full color aspect of literary sections, especially the ones that are organizing centers. I usually will list, they're probably in any given literary section, there'll be 4 or 5 core words. And I actually give the Greek word and the range of the translation on it. The range that points the direction I think it should go, and it gives you a totally different understanding, and in many cases solves centuries of debate. This because of the same word, because they put words in there that really don't fit the context, and we're scared to wander out of terms in the Bible that don't have systematic theology definitions and roots to it. So I think it screws up book after book, and why we wind up with inductive topics and we're not cutting edge with the author's intent and literary design. Huge implications for Bible translation.
So when we consider translations that are dynamic equivalent, still doesn't fit what we are talking about in terms.
Sometimes it does. Sometimes it does. If the person that's taking the dynamic, well, you have to be really, really careful, because you can replace the dynamic equivalence. Instead of words that are in Western theology, you'll pick words that are in the culture that people can relate to but actually don't carry the concept. So you get in equal trouble by swinging that direction. But on the other hand, I think that if you have, say this the right way, it's on a continuum of literal or dynamic equivalence kind of thing. And I think you can, if you really understand the coming from the corpus linguistics, and you've really done a good job with the intent and literary design, and you get down to some concept that's a pretty rough construction that's hard to move across the culture, I think we can put flexibility into our translation, as long as we're absolutely true to it. But once you get it, I was talking with Michael again, because Bill and I worked, and Bill produced the manual on Bible translation. The Bible translation needs to be in the hands of the networks that are over network mother tongue languages that are, the network main languages, which are over the mother tongue languages. And so we've been committed to that process, and but the reality is, Michael was saying, in one sense, we don't even need that. And that's exactly what we're discovering with Renton, because most of you haven't met Renton. We should introduce him. He's the only Chinese here, and he's lonely. But he's mastered our stuff, and he and his wife, particularly his wife, 10, 12 hours a day, is doing the translation. Well, they got the corpus linguistic philosophy and are mastering their understanding of mastering the scriptures, and are able to naturally do translation from that. Not like they have to have a Bible translation course. And we know the feedback we're getting is just tremendous on the translations.
May I just say one thing? Because Jeff, you use a lot of anti-right version Bible in your booklet, but we don't really have the anti-right version Chinese Bible. So basically we have to translate the Bible by ourselves, which sometimes we are in trouble, you know. You cannot translate Bible by yourself, and you need to respect the holy version, like King James or whatever, you know. Sometimes we are in trouble.
Yeah, if you really believe in the framework, these guys have proven the fact that, and at a pretty fast pace, very disciplined pace, but a pretty fast pace. And then you can easily crowdsource it with some of the, the key networks as well. But it changes the whole game.
It does.
Of Bible translation.
Yeah, it changes the game. Let me give you an example. In Matthew 16, or across the New Testament, when the word church is used, think about the passages where the word church is used. That, in Matthew 16 in particular, that word is used at King James. During the Protestant Reformation, there was all this diaspora kind of translations, and people were starting to get their hands on the text after the printing press. You've got a king who wants to make a version for the whole civilization. It's a good ideal to go for, but who translated the King James? It was a bunch of academic institutionalists. So they used a lot of high church words, and so the word church first appears then. It first appears then. Otherwise, we're using other words in order. And so now when we read Matthew 16, I will build it's not my gathering and my assembly. I'm going to build my church. And so for 500 years, what people think that means is a building where people go in and they attend. And so that's what Scripture says. Read it right here. It says it right here. So that's just a primary example of how it's syntagmatic. The syntax. We've interpreted that sentence, and then we translate that sentence outside of understanding the framework and the core arguments. Jeff made up a word called Wycliffian at one point, because that's the for 100 and some years now, Wycliffe has been the main Bible translation entity in the world. And so, but that's all it's all based off a syntax. It's all based off interpreting, and it's like inductive Bible study, where you just read a verse, you underline the verbs, you underline the why, you underline the nouns. What does this mean to you? Now that you pull those pieces out, it's a very dangerous way to try to understand what something means.
I've been involved with the Wycliffe family of translations, about 5 of them, for 30 years, and gone to their conferences and talked about these ideas and that sort of thing. But in the last few years, David Reeves, who many of you have met, started Unfolding Word, which is really intended to be church-based Bible translation and to shift the whole paradigm. Excuse me. And making progress. And back at that time, when I was telling, he's trying to
outguess
save
your
my
coughs.
coughs.
Yeah.
But at that time, Dave asked if Michael could become chairman of the board of Unfolding Word. And so they're the only ones that are in church base. And so now Michael's had such impact that they're pushing him to stay and saying they're going to go the direction more and more of apostolic teams and that sort of thing, which I believe. But at the same time, the reality is there's still the element of what I call what was it? Wycliffian.
Wycliffian.
Yeah.
There's
what is
paradigm residue. There's
it?
Wycliffian.
I invented the word Wycliffian.
No, Wycliffian.
Yeah, Wycliffian. For the fundamental
Still not right, but yep. got
error.
it.
And I mean, I'm saying we work in debate, we work in renewal, we're not trashing people. But the reality is, we're having to make a decision because we know what we're doing at this stage. And now we've got 400 people groups, unreached people groups, that are in that charted circle which you saw Sunday morning related to just Western China. And we can't go slow. And we can go fast if we don't have all of these rules and regulations and we work through somebody who's willing to take that on in any one of those languages, and you're all able to do it, and just give a few guidelines for doing it. And so the debate is that we were just having is, does he stay, or is it not worth our time anymore? We got to go out and work at a faster pace and completely integrate it into, our process.
I think in years to come, as your networks and the networks that work with us around the world, if you get the mastering the scriptures, if you have people that can truly master the text, master Paul's traditioning process, you can do Bible translation, because you'll know the topos, you'll know the constellation of ideas around it, better than any linguist who's just going after sentence by sentence translation. And you're involved in the culture. You cannot replace someone who's not involved in the culture to translate it in a mother tongue. It's too hodgepodgey. So you got to empower the church, but the church has to know and master the teaching of Paul, Peter, and John.
Yeah. All right. And the 5 or 6 Bible translation organizations, the main ones that are out there, raise $90 million a year.
Yeah, more than that.
What's that?
It's a lot more than that.
A lot more than that.
They do that in
churches
2.
For a Bible translation system that's broken.
They do that at their one event each year. Anyway, we could talk about that for a long time, but it's quite a paradigm shift. What else did you talk about at your tables? Corpus linguistics was the first one. What else? Brian and Babu are trying to talk it out, but luckily we're going over here. You're off the hook for at least a few minutes. James, you don't look Indian.
No, I'm American. Yep, I was here at a table with Don and David, and we started talking about the on page 22, the first one, a new hermeneutic, Paul, a coherent thinker, and Don had brought up, and I kind of elaborated on, if people begin to understand Paul as a non-coherent thinker, then why is any other biblical author a coherent thinker as well? If you start chipping away at a whole section of the New Testament, then why is the rest of the New Testament any more coherent than Paul? And we connected this too in our own cultural situations. The church ends up losing its teeth completely if you remove the text from the situation that it was intended to be, the situation that it was written to, and then is intended to be understood in order to properly interpret the text. And you end up with, here in town, churches that have no idea how to think about cultural issues in a complex way. They don't understand the New Testament at all, and it can kind of lead to a disregard of the biblical text, in my experience with some people, realizing the Bible isn't very important. It's kind of just a set of wisdom, a bunch of pearls that you can attain through inductive reasoning in a Bible study. But the church completely loses its capacity to deal with cultural issues. That's why you see churches here in town that fly the LGBTQ pride flag, or they fly the movements of social causes. They have no idea how to think about those kind of things. in an integrated manner. So you end up with a situation in Spain where people are only Catholic in the sense that they're born there and they're baptized when they're born, and they go to a funeral that's Catholic when they die. And here in the States and here in Uganda, in David's situation, they struggle with witchcraft. So the Catholics carved out a whole section in Scripture or in their understanding of the text to make room for witchcraft, saying if someone's doing witchcraft, then, I'm paraphrasing, someone from the church has to be there to kind of pray over the food or whatever, but they're completely capitulating to that ideal. And the same thing's happening here in the West. It's because the Bible completely loses all teeth if you completely strip away the cohesion of the New Testament.
Mm-hmm. Good observation. Excellent observation, James.
Well said. You gonna translate for him?
Is that on, Steve?
Here we go. All right, yeah. Summarizing what the guys here at the table were sharing in their Islamic context, but particularly not just that, but even thinking culturally, and talking about the question of why are the first principles so transformational? Why is it such a different experience from what has come before, particularly from Western missionaries in the Western system, rather than being imposed and sort of received in a superior, inferior kind of setting. The teaching then is allowed to root itself in the lives of people and in their everyday discussions, especially when it's in the context around the table and a meal, that there's a lot more freedom. And people are able to exchange and hear ideas from one another and learn in that way that they actually resist in the other way, because that's the way Islam came to them, or any other imposing ideas. Even in two different cultures, one that is Arabic in nature, as I understood from you, Musa, but then the native culture that the Arabic culture came and imposed itself on, it works equally well in both of those, without the sort of the nationalistic tendency or the reservation that you could have around the same teaching. So there's working equally in both of those culture. Just the freedom and the. I asked the guys, what's that transformation looking like? It says people talking who never talked before, people offering ideas. The guy in Paris that you were mentioning. So just bringing it right down into the life of people, just as Paul was doing in the churches, was something these guys has been noticed in a very short time in their Islamic context.
So the power of the first principles and the power of the first principles through their dialogue with each other is what we hear you saying. What else did you talk about? Babu and Brian, did you duke it out, figure out which one of you was going to say something? No? Joshua was going to say something? I can read your lips. I can tell what you're saying. Actually, I can't, but I can tell by your body language what you're saying. What else did you talk about? Brian, Zach, Brian there.
Oh, I'll just see him. So we see his writing in a fresh light beyond the traditional Western hermeneutics, and understanding Paul as a coherent thinker, his use of schema and principle and processes and practices, and how his letters contribute to church tradition and organization. So even if you're coming from Indian context, or we talk about our rich culture and diversity, and the language, and even the caste system that you were talking about in the morning. So if I address all those, I see Paul's problem-solving model in response to the cultural challenges and also the theological disputes within the early Christian communities. And this is, I would say, a fixed model. It's not just that he was addressing the people of the early churches, but he's setting up a foundation for generation to generation. Mm-hmm. So even for us, no matter where are we from, which country are we from, despite of our linguistical challenges and the cultural diversity, we can use the model because he set up a model to solve these problems, no matter it's a cultural challenge or a theological disputes. At the same time, I see him building and sustain apostolic networks and assess leadership acumen and strengthen complex church structures. So I would say, like what Jesus was doing in the gospel, we see him setting up the churches when he say, I will build my church and the gates of the hell will not prevail against it. And we see Paul is like setting up a common doctrine for everyone, no matter what is your denomination, what is your thought, but he's setting up a kind of a doctrine for everyone to follow. So, and I believe that what he set up as a model, as a doctrine, no matter what we are from, which background we are from, or the denomination, we all tend to follow that. So the last thing I would say here, the role of the gospel and apostolic tradition, their use in shaping church leadership and doctrinal clarity, and their impact on the new perspective of Paul. So these are the observations that I have been talking about. Even the canonical structure, we see how Paul, examining the Paul corpus, its relationship with the gospel and early letters, and even the Catholic epistle and its role of shaping the entire early church theology. So that's all we have talked about so far.
That was a lot.
Yeah.
That was
That was
great.
good.
No, that was wonderful. Paul's apostolic traditioning
That's right.
is the word we're using to describe that deposit, what'd you say, the doctrine.
Exactly.
Paul had a traditioning process, and this will be, I think these first two sessions in some ways are the hardest because they're the rest of the time the sessions 3 through 7 here will actually help you make sense of everything we've talked about in these 1 and 2. So glad to hear the overview there, Brian. That was a thorough overview. You didn't do just one. You did 5 if I counted right.
Thank you.
But hang in there because this will get clearer and clearer. And especially as you dedicate yourself to this traditioning process over years of time, your confidence will grow about what you're to do. That was encouraging, Brian. A few others yet. Let's keep going. Y'all were talking, so it doesn't need to be a big deal. Okay, we're going to get East Africa on the board. And you're Joshua, right?
We had a question here on our table. We wanted to understand clearly some of the few or little shortcomings from the Western hermeneutic and biblical interpretation of scriptures as compared to Paul's coherent thinking. So what were some of the shortcomings? Because before you rethink anything, you need to close the gaps of the old strategy. Then you draw steps towards the new thinking, and then probably you point it out for people to understand it clearly. So we wanted to know what were some, apart from it being academic and systematic, Could there be any other shortcomings of the Western hermeneutic thinking as compared to the Pauline model? So,
In addition to what did he say?
Well, you're saying you need to close the gaps in the old paradigm first?
yeah, in the Western paradigm,
So what is a list of all the gaps?
what were other shortcomings in the old paradigm or the Western hermeneutic thinking, biblical interpretation?
And he said the two that you picked up from what we're saying are...
Apart from being academic and systematic, yeah. Could there be any other gaps as compared to the coherent Paul thinking?
Boy, that's a tough. Why is that important?
Because if you are to introduce anything new or any new perspective on something that has been old,
Yeah.
there must be gaps that you need to address. And here, you've clearly illustrated Paul's coherent thinking
Yep.
and his hermeneutic biblical interpretation. But what were the Western...
What are some of the other
yeah.
problems?
So some of them we list in that S-curve paper.
Yeah.
Some of them we do, and one of them that we mentioned a couple different times, it splinters. The old paradigm splinters into specialities, and then you end up becoming an expert in your tower, in your speciality. And one of the big ones is around the gathering. Is how is the church to gather? Mm-hmm. And that's another big one to list. Is most people think about a building with a steeple versus a gathering, an assembly of believers.
Okay.
I mean, you could. I'm not sure why you want to list it. It's like asking how many gallons of water are in the ocean.
Because I'm thinking, I'm thinking that was their theologian culture. So, if that was their interpretation of
Bible translation. Becomes
yes, maybe, probably.
That becomes a big problem. I mean, the way people think their involvement in the church, most Christians.
Other things that we might, when you use the term, what's the term, unbundled, or
find the gaps in the old
find the gaps.
paradigm.
Yeah.
They keep saying
list
other things
list
that
the
we're going to
gaps.
have to undo,
Yeah.
is what he means by gaps, I think.
Yeah.
Like,
Oh, okay.
Like,
Exactly.
Is that, okay, yeah.
Yeah.
And see, I think that one of the other real serious problems is helping people begin to identify the fact that they have to deconstruct their secondary tradition. See, when you talk about Paul's traditioning process, we're talking about the apostolic teaching, the apostolic tradition passed on to the churches. Core of it is Paul, but the apostolic teaching, the apostolic tradition is also, Peter and John and some collection of leaders around them. That's all the primary tradition handed down by the apostles. But most of us never learn the primary tradition. The first principles go after the primary tradition. We learn a secondary tradition, a Baptist tradition, an Anglican tradition. And so most of the hermeneutical works are written from one of those traditions to preserve the tradition. And so actually it's first, if you get the primary tradition in there, people from all different traditions will pretty much see the same thing, if that's what you're going after. And so then you have to really be aware of what you've got to deconstruct, And so I think you've got to deconstruct the secondary traditions in many cases, because there's a small core, really, of the first principles and the teaching delivered to the churches. But we create in our denominations a big part of the core, so 50%, becomes all the answers are right there, when they're supposed to be being thought differently in different cultural settings. And so to me, that's a really big deal to deconstruct. We've said all along, you give me somebody, a pagan off the street that can't find Philippians in the New Testament, You take them through the first principles one time. But if they've been churched in a tradition, you got to take them through the first principles 2 times to deconstruct them and reconstruct them.
Yeah.
If they've been to seminary, it's 3 times.
Sure.
It's an old joke. Some of you say, I hear that. Every time I come to this conference, I hear him say that. Yeah.
You said you had another question?
No?
No?
That's what, yeah.
Good.
That's a start.
Yeah.
I'm interested in your tables of, did any of you really focus on the relationship of these constructs, hermeneutical constructs, to the radical difference of your experience in going through something like the first principles? Because it's going to be more radical, I think, when you get into mastering the scriptures. You're going to see entire books differently. That's not a good question. It didn't work before, but you need to know that there's a connection between the effectiveness of these resources and the hermeneutic. Because if we were operating on the Western academic hermeneutic, you'd have a completely different resource, and it wouldn't have the effect. That's too abstract a question, but.
Who else? Byra, you got anything up there? Mongolia hasn't been represented yet. No? Yeah, you're giving me the wave. He's translating while we're talking, and so others can hear him, can understand him. So that's a full-time job. It's a full-time job to understand us in English, let alone translating it. Javier, Jorge at the Latin quarter, or Serge and Jean-Claude in the French quarter. Here it comes.
Somewhat connected to what Jeff was asking, we were kind of looking back to our experience with the First Principle series and understanding that the fact that Paul was not writing, he's not writing a theology of Paul, you know, but actually the way that he is doing it is the framework is the expansion that we see in the book of Acts, and then when you locate, you situate every single of the letters in that context, plus the fact that he's writing in answering to specific situations, then that sheds light on the whole idea of, as we do the interpretation of the different passages, we're not approaching topics in themselves. Mm-hmm. You know, we are dealing with specific areas that Paul is addressing in the context of establishing these churches, you know. So that integrates everything.
That's great.
That brings an integration that we don't experience in the traditional way of approaching the scriptures, a fragmented way of doing it. And to me, well, to the group, that is a really relevant understanding when it comes to reading the epistles of Paul and the practical application of that understanding on the establishing of the churches in our particular contexts. Yeah.
Let me airplay. I have a little drawing I made for that. Because you have to understand when you're entering into the text. Let's see here. For all of the good things that Apple does, their AirPlay is not a solid product. Jeez, how many times I had to try? That's my 4th try. Made it. This is session 3, 4, and 5 tomorrow in drawings, but and this is what Brian, you were talking about. Paul was passing on a tradition. But Javier, what you were talking about is when you're entering into these topics, you're entering into a whole collection of topics. You're not entering in just a one dot here, all on its own, and then you just take that and say your prayers at night, and you're good to go. Too often, that's what a Bible studies are. Is they're just spread out topics rather than see them as you got an organizing center, but you have all these topics that surround it.
Even when you're reading 1 Corinthians 11 through 14, that whole section.
11:7, yeah, the gathering.
We tend to take that section and just take topics out of them.
Yeah.
Not understanding what is Paul really addressing.
Well, how many people get married in the United States, for example, and use 1 Corinthians 13 as the marriage one? And it has nothing to do with marriage. Now, you can use it, and in some regard that's too harsh to say, but it's about the gathering of the church. It's giving us instructions on the ethos and the culture within the church. And when you gather, now, can that be used in marriage? Well, yeah, you can. But it's just so interesting to me how so many leaders of our churches grab that, and that's the core piece of the use. When in fact it's for brothers and sisters, it's for one another in love.
For me, it was kind of impressive when I read from Luke Timothy Johnson, where he says, those that say that they're writing a book on the theology of Paul, they're not understanding really, because Paul was not writing a theology of Paul when he wrote his epistles. So that's just a totally different way of understanding all that.
Yeah, and what's ironic, I won't mention some of the authors because I would be raising my blood pressure. But there's a lot of the authors now, because Old and New Testament theology are coming in, is that you have systematic theologians that now are writing Old and New Testament theologies. And one format is, okay, we'll do the 8 main, like soteriology, etc., of John, and then we'll do soteriology of Peter, or the point is, if you are a systematic theologian enough that you've written substantially or run a department on systematics, there's not enough years in the remainder of your life to deconstruct yourself to do pure biblical theology. Walt Kaiser told me, it was part of my motivation. He told me I was would have been 78. So the first time I knocked on his door and asked for a whole day of his time was 76 probably. So I would have been 24, at that time. And, but he said to me, because I got the concept right away, and he said to me, you can't write toward an Old Testament theology, because he said toward, he never wrote an Old Testament theology, toward an Old Testament theology. He said, you can't write toward an Old Testament theology before you're 50. You couldn't do it, and so the idea of a lifetime in the other paradigm, and now they're the ones that are writing, I buy them all because you gotta protect the churches and circle the wagons, but I've not seen one that is written in a way that genuinely at least respects the author's intent, literary design, and at least the literary core teachings out of it. I mean, and if you put that all together in the right way, you could call it a New Testament theology of Paul, but it's really toward. But even then, it's really dangerous. That's why what we're doing is creating a process, because you have to go through that process, and we don't go further than Paul went in his cultural situation. So you're right. These are all situational. The letters are all situational documents. Yeah, and keep in mind, this is the base. And really hang in there on it, and bring your guides, bring these things, your assessment guide thing, tomorrow, because we don't know how much time we'll have to put stuff into practice. But when I went back through these sets of these 7 sessions, which we're doing in 5 because we're combining, after I got done with the first 2, I thought, oh man, this is going to kill them. There's not near enough explanation for some of the things in there. But as I went in one sweep through all 7 and then did it again, it really will build on these first 2 sessions. And I think by the end of session 5, you're going to see the relevance of this and how you can actually use it, and probably the most significant tool for building the mental acumen and for having benchmarks and how to measure and establish your church networks, not only within the framework, but with the same type of skill that someone like Paul did it. We can, I think that'll come into view by the time we hit the 5th session. But it might not, so come back next year and we'll do it again. It's okay.
All right. Anybody else? Otherwise, I think, let me leave you, repeat just a little bit what Jeff said and a few more things. Tonight, read session 3 and 4 in your booklets, in these thick booklets. That's what we're going to go through. They're relatively short. You don't have to make sense of every single word in there, but read it so you've lit the flame of intelligence and you're familiar with it. So session 3 and session 4 we will do tomorrow, and then remind you again, bring this booklet. Renton, who's got it? This booklet. Bring this booklet with you tomorrow as well. We'll start at 9 o'clock. We'll have a song or two again, and we'll talk about how that song is integrated into the life of our churches. And then we'll pick up session 3 in the morning and session 4 in the afternoon. Okay? All right. See you tomorrow.